The alarm on Ezra Cole's phone went off at 4:45 in the morning, the way it had every workday for the past 14 months, and he was already awake when it did. He lay on his back in the narrow bed of the apartment he shared with his mother on Maplewood Avenue in Detroit, staring at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the sounds of the building settling around him. The radiator in the corner ticked and hissed. A car passed on the street below. Somewhere down the hall, a neighbor's television was still running from the night before, the sound of it coming through the walls as a low, indistinct murmur. He got up without turning on the overhead light. He knew the room well enough to move through it in the dark, which was not a skill he had cultivated so much as one that had simply accumulated over years of early mornings and late nights, in spaces that were never quite big enough and never quite bright enough, but were his, or at least the closest thing to his that the circumstances allowed. He dressed in the dark, work pants, thermal undershirt. The long-sleeve shirt he kept separate from everything else because no amount of washing fully removed the smell of the garage from it, and he had stopped trying. He tied his boots at the foot of the bed, double knotting the left one, because the lace on that boot had a weak spot near the aglet that he kept meaning to replace and kept not getting around to. He went to the kitchen and put water on for instant coffee, and while it heated, he opened the cabinet above the refrigerator where his mother kept things she did not use often, and he reached past the extra candles and the flashlight and the old pill bottles she saved in case she needed them someday, and he found what he was looking for by touch. A small frame cheap wood, the kind that came in a pack of 3 from a drugstore. He brought it down and set it on the counter and looked at it while the water heated. The photograph inside the frame was old enough that the colors had shifted toward yellow. At the edges, the particular warm deterioration of photographs from the early 90s, before digital photography made permanence easy and unremarkable. It showed a man in his late 20s standing in front of a garage bay door, wearing a dark work uniform with a patch on the chest, smiling in the way of a man who is genuinely pleased to be exactly where he is. The man's hands were at his sides and his shoulders were back, and there was something in the quality of his posture that was neither posed nor accidental, but simply the natural carriage of someone who has found the work he was meant to do and knows it. The man was Samuel Cole. Ezra had been 11 years old when his father died, old enough to remember the shape of him, the smell of him, the particular sound of his voice when he was explaining something that mattered to him, old enough to carry those things forward, young enough that the memories had the quality of objects handled too often worn smooth at the edges from the years of returning to them. The details still present, but the edges softened in ways he could not always account for. He looked at the photograph for a moment the way he looked at it every morning, not with grief exactly, not anymore, but with the particular attention of someone checking in on something important before the day begins. Then he put it back in the cabinet above the refrigerator next to the candles and the flashlight, and he poured his instant coffee and drank it, standing at the counter because there was no time to sit. He did not know as he stood in that kitchen in the dark, drinking coffee made from powder and hot tap water, that the man in the photograph had once stood in front of the exact bay door he was about to drive to. He did not know that his father had spent 7 years of his working life in that building, had learned its rhythms and its particular sounds and its mechanical personality the way Ezra was learning them now. His mother had not told him, not because she was hiding it, but because by the time Ezra was old enough to have asked the right questions, she had put so much of that period of their life away that retrieving it felt like opening something sealed for a reason. So Ezra drove to work every morning with his father's face in his memory and his father's work ethic in his hands, and he had no idea that he was walking the same floors his father had walked, touching the same walls, working under the same lights. He only knew that the place felt in some way he had never tried to put into words, like somewhere he was supposed to be. Holt and Mercer Auto was a 6-bay garage on Trumbull Avenue in Detroit, one of 10 locations in a regional chain that had been operating under various names and configurations since the mid-'80s. The Trumbull location was the original, the oldest, the one the company literature called the flagship. Though in practice it looked like every other garage Ezra had ever worked in fluorescent lights. Concrete floors, the accumulated grime of decades absorbed into every surface, until cleaning it was more philosophy than possibility. The bays were wide and well equipped. The lift in Bay 3 had a hydraulic hesitation that everyone knew about and nobody had fixed. The coffee maker in the break room produced something that was technically coffee, in the way that a sketch is technically a portrait. Ezra arrived at 5:28, 2 minutes ahead of when he usually arrived, which was itself 32 minutes ahead of when his shift officially started. The lot was empty except for the 2 overnight vehicles that had been left for morning service. He parked his truck at the far end and got his bag from the passenger seat and walked to the side entrance, which he opened with the key he had been given at the end of his first week, when the then assistant manager had decided he was trustworthy enough for unsupervised access. He turned on the lights in bays 1 and 2 and stood for a moment in the early morning quiet of the garage, which was one of his favorite things. This particular silence before the other techs arrived and the noise of the day began. There was a quality to it that he associated with possibility, with the space between what was broken and what could be fixed, which was the space where his best thinking happened. He checked the schedule board. Bay 2 had a 2019 Chevrolet Tahoe with a transmission issue that the previous shift had logged as intermittent slipping under load diagnosis, incomplete customer. To return tomorrow. Ezra looked at the vehicle. He looked at the notes. He pulled the key from the board and got in and drove it to the end of the lot and back, feeling what the transmission was doing, letting it tell him what it needed. He had a feeling for machines the way some people have a feeling for weather, an ability to read what was happening before it fully presented itself, to hear in the subtle vibrations of an engine or the particular resistance of a gear shift, something that had not yet become a problem, but was working toward one. His instructors at the technical college had called it mechanical intuition, which he understood was their way of acknowledging something that did not quite fit into the curriculum. His father had called it listening. He spent the next 2 hours on the Tahoe, working methodically through the transmission system, identifying the source of the slip, replacing the part that needed replacing, testing, and adjusting until the vehicle did exactly what it was supposed to do. When he was finished, he wrote up the service notes in the same clear, precise language his father had taught him. What the problem was, what caused it, what he did, what to watch for. He left the notes clipped to the key and hung it back on the board and moved to the next vehicle. The other techs began arriving at 7. Ezra knew them all by now, the way you know people you work beside every day, their habits and their competencies and their particular ways of taking up space in a room. There was Danny Morse, who was 26 and had been at Holt and Mercer for 3 years and who was good with electrical systems but impatient with anything mechanical. There was Pete Sallows, who was 41 and had the slow, certain movements of a man who has been doing the same work for 20 years and has no intention of doing anything else. There was Calvin Webb, who was 34 and who told the same 4 jokes on rotation and laughed at all of them. There was Ted Grillo, who did not talk much and worked fast and clean. And there was Vince Garner. Garner was 47 years old and had been the managing supervisor at the Trumbull location for 8 years, which meant he had been here long enough to have become the location in some fundamental way, to have shaped its culture and its rhythms to the point where it was difficult to imagine the place existing in a different form. He was a compact man with the kind of face that communicated authority without warmth, sharp features and watchful eyes, and a mouth that almost never moved into anything that could be called a smile. Only occasional approximations of one when a situation seemed to call for it. He ran the garage with a competence that was not in question, and a fairness that absolutely was. Ezra had understood this within his first 3 weeks. It was not something Garner announced or even appeared aware of. It operated through the ordinary mechanisms of workplace management, the assignment of shifts, and the distribution of tasks and the allocation of vehicles. The thousand small decisions that accumulate over weeks and months into something that has a shape, a pattern, a direction. The pattern, as it had arranged itself around Ezra, was this: the vehicles that came in with complex problems, the ones that required real diagnostic thinking and carried higher service fees and provided genuine learning, those went to Pete Sallows or Danny Morse or Ted Grillo. The vehicles that came in needing oil changes and tire rotations and routine maintenance, the work that was necessary and honest, but that did not build skill or reputation, those went to Ezra. The late arriving customers who needed someone to stay past closing went to Ezra. The cars left by other shops when their mechanics gave up went to Ezra. Garner had never said anything explicitly discriminatory. He did not need to. The arithmetic of the schedule said everything that needed to be said. Ezra had complained once in the first month professionally, and without accusation, to the assistant manager who had given him his key. The assistant manager had listened and nodded, and said he would look into it. Nothing changed. Ezra did not complain again. He had made a decision in those first weeks that he reaffirmed every morning he would do the work he was given, better than anyone thought possible. And he would do the work he was not given, whenever the opportunity arose. And eventually, the quality of his work would become impossible to ignore. He did not know if this was optimism or stubbornness. He suspected it was both. At 9:15, his phone buzzed on the workbench. He wiped his hands and looked at the screen. His mother's number. He answered. She said she was fine. She always said that first, a habit she had developed because she knew he would assume the worst if she did not lead with it. She said she was fine, but the rent situation had become more complicated than she had expected, and the number she had in the account was not quite what she had thought it was, and she was trying to work out the difference before the 15th. But she wanted him to know, because she thought he should know. He told her he would handle it. She said she did not want him handling it. She was handling it. He said he knew she was handling it, and he would help her handle it, which was not the same as handling it for her. And after a moment, she acknowledged the distinction and said, "Okay." He put the phone back on the workbench and stood for a moment looking at the underside of the vehicle he was working on, which was a 2016 Honda Accord that needed new brake pads and a rotor inspection, and was the kind of job that took 40 minutes and cost $200, and was in the ongoing arithmetic of his life not enough. He was 20 years old. He had a certification from Detroit Technical College and 14 months of shop experience and a diagnostic ability that he knew without arrogance was not common. He was living with his mother in a 2-bedroom apartment on Maplewood Avenue and sending most of his paycheck to the general category of things that needed to be covered and keeping what was left, which was not much for what he called savings, which was generous as a description of the amount. He went back to work. The morning moved the way mornings in the garage moved in the rhythms of vehicles and tasks and the particular social weather of a shared workspace. Della Marsh arrived at 9:30 as she did every day and hung her bag on the hook by the break room door and put on her work gloves and moved to whatever bay Garner had assigned her. Della was 22 and had been at Holt and Mercer for 6 weeks. Technically an apprentice, though the distinction had never been clearly explained to her in terms of what it meant for her trajectory or her compensation. She was the only other person of color on the full technician side of the operation, a fact that had created between her and Ezra a kind of unspoken recognition, not quite solidarity in any organized sense, but the acknowledgement of shared context that people carry when they move through the same rooms under the same particular conditions. She was observant in a way that was not immediately apparent. She listened more than she talked, and she watched things that other people did not watch, the patterns of behavior in the room, the way decisions move from one person to another, the small transactions of power that most people in workplaces learn not to see, because seeing them requires a response. Ezra had noticed this about her early on and respected it. She had noticed him noticing and had given him a small nod across the garage that communicated something real between them without requiring words. At 10:47, the bell above the front door sounded. Ezra was at the workbench with his back to the door when it happened, but he heard the difference in how the room responded. The garage had a sound when someone ordinary walked in, a continuation of itself, the work carrying on around the interruption. This was a different sound. A pause. Not long. 2 seconds, maybe 3. But definite. He turned. The man standing in the entrance was large, in the way of someone who had been large for a very long time. Not the constructed bulk of someone who works at it, but the settled mass of a man who has simply been built this way and has spent decades making use of it. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with a beard that had gone mostly gray, and arms visible below the rolled sleeves of his flannel that were covered in tattoos from his wrists to where the fabric ended. He wore a leather vest over the flannel, and the patch on the back of the vest told you everything you needed to know about which world he came from and who he rode with. His name, though Ezra did not know it yet, was Rudy Holt. He crossed the floor to the reception counter with the particular gait of a man who is containing urgency, keeping it inside the form of normal movement through an act of will. His face was the face of a man who had been awake all night, which he had been. His daughter, 16 years old, had taken a bad fall from her bicycle the previous afternoon on Woodward Avenue when a car door had opened into her path. She had been taken to Detroit Medical Center by ambulance. She had been in surgery since 11 the previous evening. He had been in the waiting room drinking coffee from a machine and staring at the wall until 2 hours ago, when he had gotten on his motorcycle to ride home for a change of clothes and a shower. And the bike had died in front of this garage on Trumbull Avenue, with a mechanical failure he had not seen coming. His daughter was still in surgery. He needed to be back at the hospital in 40 minutes. Sandra, the receptionist, looked up from her computer when he reached the counter. She was 53 years old and had been at this location for 11 years, and had developed over those years a fluency in the unspoken signals of the job, which customers to prioritize and which to route toward patience and delay. She looked at the vest and the tattoos and the face, and she performed in approximately 2 seconds an assessment that told her nothing useful about the man in front of her, but told her a great deal about herself. She said they were backed up. She said it would be at least 2 hours before anyone could look at a walk-in. She said he could leave the vehicle and they would call when there was availability. He said he did not have 2 hours. He said his daughter was at Detroit Medical, and he had to be there, and his bike was outside. and he needed it fixed now. Sandra said she understood that, but their schedule was their schedule, and there was nothing she could do about it. Garner appeared from the door of his office at the sound of the exchange. He assessed the situation with the same speed Sandra had and reached the same kind of conclusion. The particular conclusion that certain men in positions of authority reach when they see someone who does not look like their usual clientele and decide the situation requires management rather than service. He said they did not service motorcycles at this location. He said it was a policy. He said the man was welcome to call a specialist shop. Rudy Holt looked at Garner with the expression of a man who has spent 54 years learning when a room has made up its mind about him before he opened his mouth, and who has therefore made his own decisions about how much energy to spend on changing the room's mind. He said he understood. He said he was sorry to have wasted their time. He turned toward the door. Ezra had been standing at the workbench 12 feet away through all of this. He had heard every word. He had watched the exchange with the still external patience of someone who has trained himself to observe. Before reacting to gather the full information, before deciding what the information means. He had seen the pause when Rudy walked in. He had heard the excuse about the schedule and the excuse about the policy. He had watched a man with a daughter in surgery turn toward the door because a room full of people with working hands had collectively decided that his appearance disqualified him from the help they were in a position to give. He put down his wrench. He walked to the side door that led directly to the lot. He was outside and moving toward the motorcycle before he had fully articulated to himself what he was doing, which was the way he made his best decisions from the hands rather than from the head, from the place that knew what was right before the mind had time to complicate it. The motorcycle was a Harley-Davidson Electra Glide, dark blue, older, but well-maintained. The kind of bike that had been cared for, the way some people care for the things that matter most to them, with consistency and attention, and the willingness to spend money on something because it deserves it. It was leaning on its kickstand near the curb, with the particular stillness of a machine that has stopped and does not intend to start again without intervention. Ezra crouched beside it. He heard the side door open behind him. He heard Garner's voice, which had taken on the particular quality it took on when Garner was addressing a situation he had not anticipated and was not pleased about. Garner said his name. Ezra did not respond. Garner said his name again differently with the weight of the supervisory relationship in it. The implicit reminder of what that relationship meant and what it required. Ezra put his hands on the motorcycle. Garner came closer. He said Ezra needed to come back inside right now. He said this was not an authorized service call. He said there was a process, and Ezra was not following it. Ezra said he would be in when he was finished. The lot was quiet for a moment. Then Garner's footsteps retreated toward the side door. Ezra heard it open and close. He worked on the motorcycle. It took him 9 minutes, which was actually longer than it should have taken, because the problem turned out to be more than one thing. A failed fuel pump relay combined with a secondary issue in the ignition circuit that had been lurking unremarked for some time. The two problems having conspired to produce a failure that looked simpler from the outside than it was. He found both problems because he was listening, because he did not stop at the first answer, when the first answer did not fully account for what the machine was telling him. And he fixed both because leaving one undone would have meant the man on this bike was one bad morning away from being stranded again. He stood. He turned the key. The Harley started on the first attempt and settled into the particular idle of a machine that is once again doing what it was designed to do. The low, steady sound of something working properly. Rudy Holt was standing at the curb. He had come back out at some point while Ezra was working, and he had stood there watching without interrupting, which was the behavior of a man who understood that you do not talk to someone while they are performing work that requires concentration. He was watching Ezra now with an expression that had changed from what it had been when he walked into the garage. The containment was still there, but something underneath it had shifted, and what had shifted had not fully announced itself yet even to Rudy. Ezra wiped his hands on the rag he kept in his back pocket. He said the fuel pump relay had failed and there had been a secondary issue in the ignition circuit that had been developing for a while. He said both had been addressed. He said the bike would need a full electrical system inspection when there was time. Rudy looked at him for a moment. He said he did not know what to say. Ezra said he did not need to say anything. Rudy reached into the inside pocket of his vest and produced a worn leather wallet. Ezra shook his head. He said there was no charge. Rudy looked at him with an expression that was not merely surprise, but something more deliberate than surprise. The expression of a man cataloging what he is seeing because he intends to remember it accurately. He said he had been in a lot of places where people had made decisions about him before he got through the door. Ezra said he was going to be late. Rudy said yes. He said he was going to be late. He swung his leg over the bike and settled into the seat. And for a moment before he put on his helmet, he looked at Ezra with the full weight of what he was feeling, which was gratitude and something older than gratitude. Something that had to do with being seen in a way that had nothing to do with what he was wearing or what he looked like. He said he would be back. Ezra gave a small nod and turned back toward the side door. It opened before he reached it. Garner was standing in the frame. The other techs were visible behind him. Pete Sallows and Danny Morse and Calvin Webb arranged in the particular way of people who have been watching something through a window and have now positioned themselves as witnesses to whatever comes next. Della Marsh was there too at the back, her face giving away nothing. Garner said Ezra was done. He said it plainly without theater, which was perhaps worse than theater, because it communicated that this was not a decision made in anger or in the heat of a confrontation, but one that had already been weighed and resolved by the time he opened the door. He said Ezra had walked off a job, ignored a direct instruction from a supervisor, and performed unauthorized work on a vehicle belonging to a walk-in customer, without a service order, without authorization, and without following any of the documented procedures that existed for reasons that should be obvious to anyone who had read the employee handbook. He said to collect his tools and his personal items and return his key to the front desk. The lot was quiet. The sound of Rudy Holt's Harley had faded in the direction of Woodward Avenue and was gone. Ezra stood in the doorframe with Garner 6 feet from him and the room of techs behind Garner, and the sound of his own breathing in his ears. He felt a clarity that was not calm, but that lived in the same neighborhood as calm, the particular state of a person who has been reduced to the essential question of who they are and what they are going to do next. He thought about his mother's call this morning. He thought about the rent and the paycheck and the number in the account that was not quite what it needed to be. He looked at Garner. He looked at the room behind Garner. He said nothing. He went inside and retrieved his tools from the workbench and his bag from his locker, and his jacket from the hook by the break room door. He checked the locker one more time to make sure it was empty and then closed it and left the key on the magnetic strip at the top of the unit where everyone who had been issued a locker key left it when they were done. He stopped at the front desk and left the building key with Sandra, who received it without looking up from her computer. He went outside. He sat on the low concrete barrier at the edge of the parking lot with his toolbox at his feet and his bag over his shoulder. and the February air moving across the lot in the direction of the street. He was not performing anything. He was simply sitting because he had nowhere immediately to go, and he needed a moment before he began deciding where that was. The side door opened. He looked up expecting Garner or one of the other techs. It was Della. She came across the lot with her hands in the front pocket of her coveralls and stopped a few feet from where he was sitting. She looked at him, and then she looked at the door she had come through, and then she looked back at him. She said she had her phone with her when Garner came outside to confront him earlier. Ezra looked at her. She said she had been standing at the window in the break room when it happened, the whole thing. From when Garner first called Ezra's name to when Ezra turned on the ignition and the bike started. She pulled her phone from her pocket and held it up. She had filmed all of it. She said she did not know why exactly. She said she had a habit of recording things that seemed important before she understood why they were important, and that this had seemed important to her. She asked if he wanted her to send it to him. He looked at the phone in her hand for a moment. He said yes. She sent it. His phone buzzed in his pocket and he felt it land. She said she was sorry about the job. He said it was all right. She looked at him with the direct, honest expression of someone who does not traffic in consolation. They do not believe. She said it was not all right. She said it was wrong and they both knew it. And she was sorry it happened. And she wanted him to know she had seen it clearly. He looked at her. He said he appreciated that. She went back inside. He sat on the concrete barrier with his toolbox and his bag and his phone, which now contained a video of him being fired for helping a man get to his daughter in the hospital. And he let the February air move around him and thought about what his father would do, which was not a question he could always answer, but which in moments like this was the most useful question he knew. He was still sitting there 20 minutes later when his phone rang with a number he did not recognize, a Detroit area code, and he answered it. And the voice on the other end was a man's voice, older, with the measured quality of someone accustomed to being listened to. The man said his name was Chester Holt. He said he believed Ezra had met his brother Rudy that morning. He said he had been watching a security camera feed from the Trumbull Avenue location on his laptop at home when a motorcycle pulled up outside and a young technician walked out of the building without being asked and got to work. He said he needed Ezra to come to his office. He said today. Ezra looked at the garage door. He looked at the sky above Trumbull Avenue, which was the flat pale gray of a Detroit February, the kind of sky that gives nothing away about its intentions. He said he would be there. He stood up. He picked up his toolbox. He walked to his truck. He drove to the cabinet above the refrigerator in his memory and looked at his father's face in the photograph. The smile and the shoulders and the uniform with the patch on the chest. And he drove across the city of Detroit in the February cold, with that image in his mind, not knowing yet what it meant, not knowing yet what was underneath it, only knowing that something had moved today and that the movement was not finished. Chester Holt's office was on the 14th floor of a building on West Grand Boulevard that had been renovated sometime in the last decade into the kind of space that communicated success without announcing it. The kind of space where the furniture was chosen by someone who understood that restraint is its own form of display. The reception area had real wood on the walls, and a woman at the front desk who smiled at Ezra when he came in without the particular hesitation that sometimes preceded the smile when he walked into rooms like this. He had stopped at his truck to change his shirt. He always kept a clean shirt in the cab, folded in a plastic bag behind the seat. not because he had planned for occasions like this one, but because his mother had told him when he got his first job that a man who works with his hands should always have a clean shirt within reach, because the world will judge the shirt before it judges the hands, and you want to choose the order of that judgment when you can. He sat in the reception area for 4 minutes before a door opened, and Chester Holt came through it. Chester was 58 years old and looked like a man who had spent those years doing something that required both physical and mental endurance, not soft in the way of executives who arrived at their positions through inherited advantage, but worn in the particular way of someone who had built something from an earlier, harder version of himself. He was taller than his brother by 2 inches and lighter by 40 pounds, and he moved with the deliberate economy of a man who does not waste motion. He shook Ezra's hand. He said he was glad Ezra had come. He led him into the office and closed the door and gestured to a chair across the desk and sat down himself, and for a moment simply looked at Ezra in the direct assessing way of someone who has spent decades making decisions about people and who takes the preliminary evaluation seriously. He said he was going to speak plainly because he did not have time for anything else, and he suspected Ezra did not either. He said that Rudy had called him from the hospital parking lot at 11:15 that morning, before he went back inside to his daughter's room, and that the call had lasted 6 minutes, and that in those 6 minutes Rudy had told him 3 things. The first was that a young technician at the Trumbull location had fixed his motorcycle without being asked and without accepting payment. The second was that the same technician had been fired for doing it. The third was the name on the work uniform the technician had been wearing. Chester said that when Rudy told him the name, he had gone to his laptop and pulled up the security camera feed from the Trumbull location, which he had access to, because he had access to the security feeds from all 10 locations, and he had watched the recording of the parking lot from that morning. He said he had watched it twice. Then he had called the number on file for Ezra Cole. Ezra sat across the desk from the CEO of the company that had just fired him and waited for the part that explained what any of this meant. Chester said he wanted to offer Ezra the position of lead technician at the Trumbull Avenue location, effective immediately with a salary that was 40% above what he had been earning and full benefits and a formal mentorship track that would put him on a path toward shop manager within 3 years if he wanted it. He said he was also terminating Vince Garner effective today. Ezra was quiet for a moment. He said he appreciated the offer. He said he wanted to understand why. Chester looked at him. He said that was a fair question, and that it deserved a complete answer, and that the complete answer was more complicated than the offer itself, and that Ezra needed to hear all of it before he decided anything. He said that Holt and Mercer Auto Group had a problem. He said the problem had been developing for approximately 3 years, though. He had only become fully aware of its dimensions in the past 6 weeks. He said the problem had a name, which was Vince Garner, and that Garner's involvement in it was not simply the story of a supervisor who ran his shop with bias and poor judgment, though it was also that. He said Garner had been, for the past 3 years, systematically providing confidential internal information to an outside party. Ezra said he did not understand. Chester said he would explain. There was a man named Boyd Sutter. Sutter was 55 years old and had spent the last 20 years acquiring undervalued automotive service businesses in the Detroit metropolitan area, buying them when they were struggling, cutting costs until they were minimally functional, and either holding them for the real estate value of the land or flipping them to larger corporate chains. He had been looking at Holt and Mercer for approximately 4 years, and for 4 years Chester had declined every approach Sutter made directly and through intermediaries because Holt and Mercer was not for sale at any price. Sutter was willing to pay. and because Chester knew what would happen to the 10 locations and the people who worked in them if Sutter got his hands on the company. Sutter's current strategy, Chester said, was not to buy the company. It was to make the company unbuyable by anyone else and unsustainable on its own, to manufacture evidence of systemic fraud and operational negligence that would trigger a mandatory audit, depress the company's value to the point where the board would have no choice but to accept a distressed sale and then acquire it at that depressed price. To do this, he needed someone inside the company. Garner had been that person. For 3 years, Garner had been providing Sutter with customer data, internal service records, financial documentation, and operational reports, and in return had received payments through an arrangement that Chester's accountant had only recently managed to partially trace. Garner had also, over the same period, been fabricating service records and billing documentation designed to create the appearance of systematic fraud documents that would be presented to the board and potentially to regulators as evidence of a company operating outside legal parameters. The board meeting at which Sutter intended to present this evidence was scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning. Ezra sat across the desk from Chester Holt and listened to all of this and let it settle. He said he understood the situation. He said he did not yet understand what it had to do with him beyond the job offer, which he appreciated, but which he needed to think about. Chester said there was one more thing. He opened the desk drawer and removed a manila folder and placed it on the desk between them without opening it. He said that when he pulled Ezra's personnel file after Rudy's call, he had found something he had not expected. He said that the Trumbull location kept archived personnel records going back to the early years of the company physical files in a storage room on the lower level, and that the file clerk who managed those records had, as part of her regular duties, cross-referenced active employee files against the archive when new employees were onboarded, looking for family connections, prior employment history, anything that might be relevant to the HR record. He said the cross-reference had flagged something when Ezra was hired 14 months ago. He said the flag had been routed to Garner as the location supervisor for review and notation. He said Garner had noted it and filed it and said nothing. Chester opened the folder. Inside was a photocopy of a personnel record from 1993. The paper was old, its edges slightly brittle, the typeface of a machine rather than a printer. At the top of the document was the Holt and Mercer logo, as it had appeared in the early 90s before the rebranding, and below the logo was a name: Samuel Cole, Senior Technician. Trumbull Avenue location. Start date, March 1991. Ezra looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Chester said he had not known Samuel Cole personally. He said the company had been smaller then, and he had been less involved in the day-to-day operations of individual locations. But he had pulled the full file after finding the cross-reference, and the file showed a man with an exceptional performance record, consistent commendations from the location manager at the time, and a termination in September 1998 that was supported by a disciplinary document that Chester, reading it now with 26 years of additional context, found questionable in its specifics and suspicious in its timing. Ezra said, "What do you mean by suspicious?" Chester said the disciplinary document that had been used to terminate Samuel Cole in 1998 cited 3 specific incidents of procedural noncompliance. He said the incidents were described in enough detail to appear credible. He said the location supervisor who signed the document at the time was a man named Garner, who had joined the company the previous year as an assistant technician and had been elevated to interim supervisor 3 months before the termination. The room was very quiet. Ezra said the name again, not as a question, Chester said yes. Ezra looked at the personnel file with his father's name at the top, and he looked at the date of the termination, and he looked at the signature at the bottom of the disciplinary form, and he understood something that he did not have words for yet. Something that had to do with the distance between what you think you know and what has actually been true all along, the particular vertigo of a truth that was always there, but that you were not positioned to see until the moment you were. His father had been pushed out of this garage in 1998 by the same man who had pushed Ezra out of it this morning. He had spent his life in the shadow of that without knowing it. He had driven to this garage every morning for 14 months with his father's photograph in his memory and his father's work ethic in his hands, and had been working in the same building where his father had worked and been undermined by the same man who had undermined his father, and he had not known any of it. He looked at Chester Holt. He said he needed a moment. Chester said to take whatever time he needed. Ezra stood and walked to the window and looked out at West Grand Boulevard, 14 floors below the cars and the pedestrians, and the ordinary motion of a Detroit afternoon, and he breathed in the way his father had taught him to breathe when something hit hard slowly, and from the bottom the way you fill a glass from the bottom up. He stood at the window for 90 seconds. Then he turned around. He said he would take the job. He said he also wanted access to the personnel archive at the Trumbull location. Chester said both were agreed. Ezra drove back to Trumbull Avenue that afternoon with a letter of appointment signed by Chester Holt and a key that had been messengered to the office before he left. And when he walked through the bay door, the room arranged itself around his entrance in the uncertain way of a room that has been told something is different, but is not yet sure what different means. Garner was not there. His office was closed and the lights were off, and his car was not in the lot, which meant Chester's call to him had already happened and had produced the result it was always going to produce once the decision was made. Ezra went directly to the storage room on the lower level. He spent 40 minutes in the archive moving through the boxes that lined the metal shelving, in the order they had been filed oldest to most recent, until he found the section that corresponded to 1998. He found his father's file. He read it in full standing under the single overhead bulb of the storage room, with the old paper in his hands, reading his father's performance reviews and his commendations in the incident reports, and finally the disciplinary document that had ended his father's 7 years in this building. He read the disciplinary document twice. The incidents described were specific enough to sound credible and vague enough to be unfalsifiable. They cited dates and vehicle service numbers that could theoretically be cross-referenced, but that would require access to records that had almost certainly not been retained. They described patterns of behavior rather than specific actions, which was the language of documentation designed to accumulate rather than to prove. It was Ezra understood now with a clarity that had not been available to him before today. A fabrication. A competent one. The work of someone who understood how to build a case out of paper and bureaucratic language, who knew that the weight of documentation convinces even when the content does not hold under scrutiny, because the scrutiny almost never comes. He took photographs of the document with his phone. He photographed the signature at the bottom. He put the file back in its box and turned off the light and went back upstairs. Della was finishing her shift when he came back through the bay. She was at the workbench in Bay 4 cleaning her tools with the particular thoroughness she brought to the end of every shift. And she looked up when he came in, and her expression asked the question without asking it. He said there were some things he needed to tell her. She listened to what he told her with the focused attention she brought to everything that mattered. Not interrupting, not reacting ahead of the information. letting the information arrive completely. Before she responded, when he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had something to tell him, too. She said that in her 6 weeks at the Trumbull location, she had developed a habit which she acknowledged was not a habit she had consciously chosen, but one that had developed in response to something she felt in the environment of the shop, a habit of noticing. She said that about 4 weeks ago, she had started noticing that Garner occasionally stayed in his office past closing time, which was not unusual for a manager, but that on 3 specific occasions, she had, for reasons she could not fully articulate, paid particular attention to what he was doing during those late sessions. She said that on each of those occasions, she had seen him at the printer in the back office. She said she had thought nothing of it the first time. The second time, she had thought it was worth noting. The third time, she had taken out her phone. She pulled her phone from the front pocket of her coveralls. She had photographed the printer output tray on the third occasion from the hallway outside the office through the glass panel in the door without Garner seeing her. The photograph showed a stack of documents in the tray. The documents were face down, but the top sheet was partially visible, and on the visible portion she could read a heading and the first 2 lines of text. She showed Ezra the photograph. The heading on the document read, "Service Fraud Summary Report, Trumbull Avenue Location, prepared for Boyd Sutter Associates." Ezra looked at the photograph for a long time. He said she had not shown this to anyone. She said she had not known who to show it to or what it meant, and that showing it to Garner was clearly not an option, and that she had been trying to work out what the right move was when things had moved this morning faster than she had time to respond to. He said she had done the right thing by keeping it. She said she had also on the same occasion taken 2 additional photographs from slightly different angles that captured more of the document stack. She had not looked at them closely until this moment. She scrolled to them now and showed him. The second photograph was clearer. It showed enough of the top document to read 3 full lines of text, including a line that described in summary language the nature of the prepared evidence, and a line that named the venue for its presentation. The Holt and Mercer board meeting scheduled for the following morning. The third photograph showed the bottom of the document stack at an angle that revealed the document beneath the top sheet. It was a different document formatted differently, and what was visible was a single line near the bottom, a signature line with a name pre-printed below it for countersignature. The name pre-printed was Boyd Sutter. Ezra looked at Della. He said her photographs and his photographs together were the beginning of something. She said the beginning of what? He said the beginning of a case that did not rely on testimony or interpretation, or the balance of one person's word against another's, but on physical documentation, prepared by Garner himself, stored on the company's own printer on the company's own paper, in a building that Chester Holt owned. He said, but it was not enough yet. He said what they had established, what Garner was doing and for whom, but what they had not yet established was the financial connection. The money that proved the relationship was not simply ideological or coincidental, but contractual. He said, without the money, the defense would argue that Garner was a disgruntled employee, acting independently, that Boyd Sutter had nothing to do with the document's creation, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding that could be explained away by a good lawyer. Between now and the board meeting, Della said, "How do you find the money?" He said he did not know yet. He said he needed to think. He went to the break room and made coffee from the coffee maker that produced something technically describable as coffee, and sat at the table and looked at the wall and thought. He had been sitting there for 20 minutes when his phone buzzed, a message from a number he had not saved. but that he recognized as the number Rudy Holt had been called from earlier the hospital parking lot when Rudy had called Chester. The message said, "My daughter came out of surgery. She's going to be all right. And then I told you I would come back." Ezra sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he called the number. Rudy picked up on the second ring. His voice was different from that morning, not lighter exactly, but the containment was different. The thing he had been holding all night had shifted with the news about his daughter, and what was left sounded like a man coming back into himself after a long time away. Ezra said he was glad about his daughter. Rudy said there was not a word for what he was. Ezra said he needed to tell him some things and ask him some things, and that the asking might be something Rudy did not want to be involved in, and that he would understand completely if Rudy wanted to leave it where it was. Rudy said to tell him. Ezra told him. He told him about Chester's offer, and about the board meeting, and about Garner and Boyd Sutter and the photographs. He told him about the personnel archive and what he had found there, and what the signature at the bottom of his father's 1998 disciplinary document meant. He told him all of it because Rudy had been at the beginning of the day that had put all of this in motion, and he had a right to the full picture. When Ezra was done, there was a long silence on the line. Then Rudy said he would be at the garage in an hour. Ezra said he did not need to do that. Rudy said he heard him. He came an hour later. He came through the bay door still in his riding gear, and he looked at the garage without saying anything. And then he looked at Ezra, and he said, "Where do you need me?" They worked through the evening, the three of them. Ezra and Della and Rudy in the break room with the documents spread across the table, organizing what they had and identifying what they still needed. Rudy contributed something that neither Ezra nor Della had: a phone call to Chester Holt that produced within 45 minutes a login credential for the company's internal financial management system, which Chester provided with the caveat that whatever they found needed to be documentable in a way that would hold up in front of the board. Ezra sat at the break room table with Chester's login credential and the company's financial records open on his laptop, and he went through them the way he went through a complicated engine, methodically from the known problem toward the unknown cause, following what was there, rather than looking for what he expected to find. It took him 2 hours. The transaction he was looking for was not obvious, which meant it had been designed not to be obvious, which was itself information. It was embedded in a series of vendor payments that appeared in the operational expenses of the Trumbull location under a vendor code that corresponded to a commercial cleaning service. The payments were regular and modest and individually unremarkable. Collectively, over 37 months, they totaled an amount that was not modest at all. The vendor code traced to a company registered in Michigan, whose registered agent was a law firm in Dearborn. The law firm's principal partners included a name that appeared once in the documents Della had photographed in a footnote on the second page of the Boyd Sutter summary report, listed as legal counsel for Sutter Associates in the matter of the proposed acquisition. The money had moved from the Holt and Mercer operational account camouflaged as cleaning service expenses through a law firm connected to Boyd Sutter. And it had been doing this for 37 months. Garner had set it up and maintained it. And it had been invisible in the financials because it was small enough in each individual instance to fall below the review threshold that Chester's accounting team applied to vendor payments. Ezra printed everything. He printed the vendor payment history. He printed the company registration for the cleaning service vendor. He printed the law firm's listed partners from their public website. He printed the page from Della's photographed document that named the same law firm as Sutter's legal counsel. He stacked the documents in the order that told the story most clearly. The way you arrange evidence when you want the story to arrive in the right sequence, so that each page answers a question opened by the page before it. He signed his name on the cover page, not because it was required, because he had decided that his name was going to be attached to this, that whatever happened tomorrow morning, he was going to be standing in front of it with his name on it, the way his father had stood in front of his work every day for 7 years in this building. He looked at the stack of documents. He looked at Della, who was at the other end of the table organizing her own photographs, and the notes she had made during the evening with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. He looked at Rudy, who was in the chair by the door with a cup of the break room coffee, which he was drinking without complaint, which said something about the man. He said he thought they had what they needed. Rudy said he thought so too. Della said she wanted to be there tomorrow. Ezra looked at her. She said she had gathered the evidence. She said she had been in this garage for 6 weeks watching things that other people were not watching and writing down things that other people were not writing down. And she had done it without knowing for certain why. And now she knew why. And she wanted to be in the room when it mattered. He said she would be in the room. He said that, in fact, she was going to be the one who presented the photographs, because the photographs were hers, and the story of how they came to exist was hers, and there was no version of the presentation that was complete without her telling that part of it herself. She looked at him. She said she had never spoken in front of a board of directors before. He said neither had he. She said that was not particularly reassuring. He said he knew. He looked at the documents, and he thought about the morning and the parking lot, and Rudy's motorcycle, and the 11 minutes it had taken to fix something that a room full of people with working hands had decided was not their problem. He thought about his father's file in the archive downstairs, the 7 years of commendations, and the disciplinary document that had ended them, the signature at the bottom. He thought about the photograph above the refrigerator on Maplewood Avenue, the smile and the shoulders and the uniform, his father standing in front of this building not knowing what was coming. He thought about what it meant that he was sitting in this same building 26 years later, holding the thing that had been done. He thought about what his father would say about tomorrow. He thought his fathers would say the same thing. He always said when a difficult job was ahead of you, which was, you know what is wrong, you know what needs doing. The only question now is whether you are going to do it. He gathered the documents and put them in a folder. He put the folder in his bag. He said they should all go home and get some sleep. Nobody moved immediately. They sat in the break room of the Trumbull Avenue garage with the fluorescent lights overhead and the coffee going cold in their cups and the folder in the bag on the table between them. And for a moment, none of them spoke. And the silence was not the silence of people who have run out of things to say, but the silence of people who have said everything that needs saying tonight and who are preparing for what comes in the morning. Then Rudy stood up. He put on his jacket and picked up his helmet from the floor beside the chair. He looked at Ezra. He said there was something he had not told him yet. He said there was something he had been carrying since his phone call with Chester that afternoon, since Chester had told him about the personnel file and the cross-reference and the name, and he had not known how to bring it up or when, and he still was not certain he had chosen the right moment. But he was going to say it now, because tomorrow was going to be what it was going to be, and he did not want to wait any longer. He said that in the summer of 1993, he had come through Detroit on a run from Cincinnati to Flint, a long ride, and he had stopped for fuel on Trumbull Avenue, and on the way back to the highway, his bike had started throwing the kind of signals that told a rider the next mile was going to be the last comfortable one for a while. He had pulled into the nearest garage, which was this one, and a man had come out and looked at the bike without saying much, and then had gone to work. He said the man's name as he had read it on the uniform patch that afternoon. When Chester showed him the personnel file was Samuel Cole. He said Samuel Cole had fixed the bike and refused payment, and that Rudy had ridden away thinking about it for the next 100 miles. The particular quality of what had happened in that garage, which was not simply mechanical service, but something that had more to do with how a person chooses to move through the world. He said he had thought about it many times since then. He said he had not known until Chester called him this afternoon that the young man who had walked out of this same garage this morning to fix his motorcycle without being asked was that man's son. He said he was sorry it had taken him this long to say it. Ezra sat at the table with Rudy's words in the room and did not say anything for a moment. And the moment extended in the way that moments extend when something true has been said in a place where true things belong. He said he had not known his father worked here. Rudy said he knew. He said his father must have been something. Ezra looked at the bag with the folder in it. He said his father used to say that a machine will always tell you what it needs. You just have to be quiet enough to listen. Rudy was quiet for a moment. He said that sounded right. He said he would see them in the morning. He put on his helmet and walked through the bay door, and the sound of the Harley starting in the lot came through the walls of the garage, the same sound that had started in the parking lot that morning, low and steady and completely composed. And then it moved away down Trumbull Avenue and was gone. Ezra sat in the empty break room with Della across the table and the folder in the bag between them. He looked at the fluorescent lights. He looked at the walls his father had looked at. He said they should go. They turned off the lights and locked the door, and Ezra drove home to Maplewood Avenue in the dark. And when he got to the apartment, he did not turn on any lights. He went to the kitchen and reached above the refrigerator and took down the frame with the photograph, and he sat at the kitchen table in the dark with it in his hands, and he looked at his father's face for a long time. He put it back. He set his alarm for 5. He lay down and closed his eyes. And in the morning there was going to be a board meeting and a folder of documents and a room full of people who did not yet know what the night had produced. And he was going to walk into that room and stand in front of it and say what needed to be said. He lay in the dark and listened to the building settle around him. He thought about quiet. He thought about listening. He slept. He was awake before the alarm. He lay in the dark on Maplewood Avenue and listened to the building and the street and the particular silence of 5 in the morning in February in Detroit, which was a silence with texture to it. The cold pressing against the windows and the radiator working against the cold. And somewhere outside, the sound of the first bus of the morning moving along the avenue with its lights on, and its handful of passengers, the people who were always awake before the city admitted it was awake. He got up. He dressed in the dark as he always did, but this morning he took the clean shirt from the plastic bag behind the truck seat and laid it on the bed instead. Because he was not going to the garage today, not to work in the bays. And the shirt he wore mattered in the way his mother had told him. It mattered not because it changed what he knew or what he could prove, but because it changed the sequence in which the room received him. And today the sequence mattered. He made coffee. He stood at the counter and looked at the cabinet above the refrigerator. He opened it. He took down the frame and set it on the counter beside his cup and looked at his father's face in the photograph the way he looked at it every morning. But this morning he looked longer and he looked differently. with the knowledge that had not been available to him yesterday morning when he last stood in this spot. He looked at the uniform with the Holt and Mercer patch on the chest, and he looked at the garage bay door behind his father's shoulders, and he understood now what he was looking at. He understood that the building in the photograph was the same building he had been driving to every morning for 14 months. He understood that his father had stood in that spot and felt about that place, something like what Ezra had felt about it from his first week. The sense of somewhere he was supposed to be, the sense that he could not fully explain, but that had been real, and that he had trusted. He understood now that the sense had not been arbitrary. He put the photograph back. He picked up his bag with the folder inside and his coffee, and he went to his truck. He arrived at the building on West Grand Boulevard at 7:40, which was 80 minutes before the board meeting was scheduled to begin, because he wanted to be there before the room filled, before the dynamic of the morning established itself without him, before Boyd Sutter arrived with his documents and his lawyer and the particular confidence of a man who has spent weeks preparing an ambush and has no reason to expect the ambush to fail. The receptionist from the previous afternoon was at the front desk. She recognized him and called up to Chester's office, and Chester came down himself, rather than sending someone, which told Ezra something about how Chester understood the morning. They rode the elevator together. Chester said he had not slept well. Ezra said he had slept fine, which was true, and which seemed to surprise Chester slightly. Chester said he had reviewed the documents Ezra had sent him the previous evening, the vendor payment history and the company registration and the law firm connection, and that he had forwarded them to the company's legal counsel, who had reviewed them overnight and had confirmed that what they showed was sufficient to establish a pattern of financial misconduct that would withstand the scrutiny of a board presentation. He said his legal counsel had also confirmed that the photographs Della had taken, given the circumstances in which they were obtained, and the location in which the printing had occurred, were admissible as evidence in any subsequent proceeding, and constituted direct documentation of a conspiracy to defraud. He said he wanted Ezra to know that whatever happened in the room this morning, the company's position was already established. The evidence existed and had been verified, and the board had been briefed privately the previous evening by Chester himself. Ezra said then, "Why are we having the meeting?" Chester said, because Sutter deserved to walk into the room he thought he had prepared and discover what was actually waiting for him there. He said some things needed to be done, not just for the outcome they produced, but for the manner in which they produced it, because the manner was itself part of the record. Ezra understood that. The conference room on the 14th floor was long and narrow, with windows along one side that looked out over West Grand Boulevard, and a table that could seat 18 people and currently had chairs for 12. The room smelled of coffee and the particular neutral air of a space kept at a controlled temperature year-round. Someone had placed a pitcher of water and glasses at intervals along the table. Someone had placed legal pads and pens at each chair. The gestures of preparation, the language of a room that takes itself seriously. Della was already there when Ezra came in. She was sitting in one of the chairs along the window side of the table, not at the table itself, but against the wall, her phone in her lap and her hands still, and her face composed in the way it was composed when she was paying attention to something internal working something out. She had dressed carefully, not formally, not in a way that was performative, but in the way of someone who understands that a room will receive you before it hears you, and who has made deliberate choices about the first impression. She looked up when Ezra came in. She said she had been there since 7:15. He said that did not surprise him. He sat at the table and opened his bag and took out the folder and set it in front of him. He did not open it. He knew what was in it. He had organized it himself, and he had the sequence memorized each page and what it established and what it connected to and what the connection proved. Rudy arrived at 10 minutes to 9. He came through the door in a jacket and slacks that he wore with the slight discomfort of a man who is accustomed to different clothes, but who understands the requirement of the occasion. He looked at the room and he looked at the table and he looked at Ezra, and gave the small nod that Ezra had come to understand was his primary form of greeting, the nod of a man for whom the gesture was complete and sufficient. He did not sit at the table. He took a position near the door, standing with his arms at his sides and his back to the wall. And he stayed there, which was where he stayed for the duration of what followed. The board members arrived between 8:50 and 9. There were 7 of them, ranging in age from their mid-40s to their early 70s. The assembled oversight of a regional company that had existed for nearly 4 decades. They greeted Chester and each other with the familiar economy of people who have been in rooms together many times and know the social choreography of those rooms by instinct. They looked at Ezra with the brief assessing glance they gave to anyone at the table they did not recognize. And then they looked at their legal pads and their phones and the coffee someone had placed at the credenza along the far wall. Boyd Sutter arrived at 9:02. He was 55 years old and had the look of a man who had built his life around a particular kind of intelligence, the intelligence of acquisition, of understanding what things were worth and what people could be made to accept, and how to move through the regulatory and legal architecture of business in ways that were technically permissible and functionally predatory. He was not physically imposing. He was medium height, well-dressed in the way of someone for whom dressing well was a professional tool, and he had the particular ease of a man entering a room he believes he has already won. He had a lawyer with him. The lawyer was younger, mid-30s, with a briefcase, and the alert posture of someone whose job for the morning was to anticipate problems before they materialized. Sutter looked at the board members and at Chester and at the table, and then at Ezra and Della, his gaze moving across them with the brief assessment of a man who has already categorized everyone in a room and filed them appropriately. He did not appear to find anything in Ezra or Della that required recategorization. Chester called the meeting to order. He said that the agenda for the morning had 2 items. The first was a presentation by Boyd Sutter Associates regarding certain allegations pertaining to the operations of Holt and Mercer Auto Group. The second was a response to those allegations from Holt and Mercer. He said he was inverting the usual order, that Holt and Mercer would present first. Sutter's lawyer leaned towards Sutter and said something quietly. Sutter's expression did not change, but something in it adjusted a slight recalibration. The expression of a man who has been told the room is slightly different from what he expected, but who is confident enough in his preparation to believe the difference is manageable. Chester looked at Ezra. Ezra stood. Ezra, he was 20 years old. He had been fired from this company's flagship location less than 24 hours ago. He had slept 5 hours and driven across Detroit in the February dark, and ridden an elevator with the CEO, and sat at a table with a board of directors. And he stood now with the folder in front of him, and the windows behind him, and 12 faces looking at him, in the particular way of people who are waiting to decide what they think. He did not feel what he had expected to feel, which was the particular variety of fear that comes from performing in front of people who have the power to determine your outcomes. What he felt instead was something closer to what he felt when he crouched beside a complicated engine. The focused clarity of someone who has done the preparation and trusts the preparation and now only needs to do the work. He opened the folder He said he was going to tell the board what had been happening at the Trumbull Avenue location for the past 3 years, and that he was going to show them the documentation that established it, and that he would answer any questions when he was finished. He said he had been a technician at the Trumbull location for 14 months and had been terminated the previous morning, and that the circumstances of his termination were directly related to what he was about to present, and that he wanted the board to have that context. He said the Trumbull location's managing supervisor had for 37 months been conducting a systematic effort to assist an outside party in acquiring Holt and Mercer at a distressed price, and that the mechanism of that effort involved the fabrication of documentation designed to support allegations of operational fraud, and that the same outside party had been compensating the supervisor through a financial arrangement concealed in the company's own operational expense records. He passed the first document down the table. He explained it. He explained what it was and what it showed and what the numbers meant when you looked at them against the vendor record they were supposed to represent. He used the language of his work, the language of diagnosis, identifying the symptom and tracing it to the cause and showing the path between them in a way that was clear and sequential and did not require the listener to take anything on faith, only to follow what the documents themselves showed. He passed the second document. He passed the third. He did not rush. He did not perform. He stood at the table in the conference room on the 14th floor of a building on West Grand Boulevard in Detroit, and he presented 37 months of concealed financial misconduct with the same methodical attention he brought to a transmission system or an electrical fault, because the discipline was the same, the discipline of following what is true rather than what is convenient, of not stopping at the first answer when the first answer does not fully account for what the evidence is telling you. When he reached the point in the sequence where Della's photographs were relevant, he looked at her. She stood. She explained in her own words and her own voice what she had seen, and when she had seen it, and why she had recorded it. She did not apologize for the quality of the images or for the circumstances in which they were taken. She held up her phone and showed the room the photographs on the screen, and she described what was visible in each one with the same directness that Ezra had used, the directness of someone who knows what they know and does not need to add anything to it to make it more than it is. The room was quiet while she spoke. Sutter's lawyer had his pen in his hand and was writing on his legal pad, but he had stopped writing somewhere during Ezra's presentation and had not started again. Sutter himself was watching Della with an expression that had undergone a significant revision from the expression he had carried into the room. The ease was gone. What had replaced it was not quite panic and not quite anger, but something in the territory between them. The expression of a man recalculating in real time. Della sat down. Ezra passed the final document. He said this was the financial trail. He said it showed the movement of money from the Holt and Mercer operational account through a vendor code corresponding to a cleaning service that had never provided any cleaning services through a registered company that was a shell entity to a law firm whose principals included counsel for Boyd Sutter Associates, and that the total amount moved through this channel over 37 months was substantial and was documented at every step by the company's own records. He said he was finished. He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than most silences in rooms like this one, because rooms like this one are generally managed to prevent silences of that length. And the silence existed because no one was ready yet to be the first to speak into it. Sutter's lawyer spoke first. He said that the documents presented contained certain assumptions and interpretive connections that his client would want the opportunity to address, and that the board should be cautious about drawing conclusions from material that had not yet been subject to independent verification. Chester said the material had been reviewed by the company's own legal counsel, who had been working through the night, and that the counsel's assessment had been provided to board members in advance of the meeting. The lawyer said he was aware of that assessment and that his client disputed its conclusions. One of the board members, a woman in her 60s with the particular patience of someone who has been in enough rooms to know when an argument is covering ground, or simply covering, asked Sutter directly whether he was disputing the existence of the financial transactions shown in the documents. Sutter said the transactions had legitimate explanations. The board member asked what the explanations were. Sutter looked at his lawyer. The lawyer said they would need time to prepare a formal response. The board member said they had had the meeting time, and she was asking now. The room was quiet again. Sutter said he was not going to respond to allegations made by an employee who had been terminated for cause. The other board member, a man in his early 70s who had been at the table the longest and who had said nothing until this moment, looked at Sutter and said that the employment status of the person who found the evidence had no bearing on the validity of the evidence itself, and that, in his experience, that argument was generally made by people who did not have a better one. Sutter's lawyer put his pen down. Chester said he wanted to say something before the board moved to deliberation. He said that the situation before the board was not simply a matter of attempted financial fraud against the company, though it was that. He said it was also, and he wanted this to be part of the record, a matter of what this company was and what it had always been meant to be, and that those things were inseparable from the people who had built it and continued to build it. He looked at Rudy, who was still standing near the door. He said he wanted his brother to say something. Rudy walked to the table. He did not sit. He stood at the end of the table with his hands at his sides, and he looked at the board members and at Sutter and at Ezra, and he took a breath. That was visible, the breath of a man who does not often speak in rooms like this one, and who has decided that this time it matters enough to do it anyway. He said he was Rudy Holt. He said most people in this room knew who he was in terms of the company, that he was a co-founder, that his name was on the original incorporation documents, and on the deed for the Trumbull Avenue property that he had stepped back from active management 18 years ago, but had retained his stake and his standing. He said he wanted to tell the board something that was not in any of the documents on the table. He said that in the summer of 1993, he had been riding through Detroit, and his motorcycle had failed, and he had walked it to the nearest garage, which was the Trumbull Avenue location. He said a man had come out and looked at the bike and fixed it and refused any payment, and that the man's name was Samuel Cole, and that Samuel Cole had been a senior technician at that location since 1991. He said Samuel Cole had done something that day that Rudy had thought about many times in the years since. He had not just fixed the machine. He had done it in a particular way with a particular quality of attention and honesty that communicated something about what he believed a garage was for and what the work meant. He had done it as if the work mattered for its own sake and not for what it would produce. And he had refused payment, as if the refusal was not a sacrifice, but simply the natural completion of a thing done properly. He said he had tried to find Samuel Cole after leaving that day. He said the years had moved the way years move, and the search had not been as persistent as it should have been. And eventually, he had lost the thread. He said he had not known until yesterday afternoon when Chester called him that Samuel Cole had been pushed out of the Trumbull location in 1998 by a fabricated disciplinary document signed by a man named Garner. The same man who had spent the last 3 years preparing to do to this company what he had done to Samuel Cole. He said he had also not known until yesterday that the young man who had walked out of the Trumbull garage the previous morning to fix his motorcycle without being asked, without authorization, without expectation of payment or recognition, was Samuel Cole's son. He paused. He looked at Ezra. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed something and held it for a moment, and then placed it on the table. It was a piece of paper folded twice soft with age, and handling the kind of paper that has been folded and unfolded many times over many years. He unfolded it carefully with the particular care of someone handling something that has become fragile from being valued, and he laid it flat on the table. It was a form, a company form, the Holt and Mercer form for employee recognition. The form that location managers had used in the early years to document commendations for outstanding work. The form was dated August 1993. In the field for employee name in the typeface of a machine that had been replaced decades ago, Samuel Cole. In the field for position senior technician. In the field for commendation exceptional diagnostic work and customer service recommended for merit review. In the field for the location supervisor's signature. A signature that was different from the signature on the disciplinary document of 1998. The signature of the man who had been location supervisor before Garner had arranged his way into the position. Rudy said he had found the form in his own files the previous evening going through boxes he had not opened in years looking for something he was not sure he would find. He said he had kept it because it had seemed important at the time, and he had not known exactly why and had simply learned over the years to trust that instinct. He said he was placing it in the record of this meeting. He said he wanted the board to understand that the person who had walked into this room this morning and presented 37 months of financial documentation with the composure and precision of someone who has been doing this kind of work for 30 years, was 20 years old and had been doing it for one day, and that the qualities that made that possible were not qualities that appeared from nowhere, and that the company would be making a significant error if it failed to understand what it had in the person sitting at this table. He said he was done. He walked back to his position near the door. The room was quiet in the way it had been quiet after Ezra finished the particular quiet of a space where something true has been said, and the truth is still arriving. The board member who had asked Sutter about the transactions looked at the recognition form on the table and then looked at Ezra. She said she had one question. She asked why he had done it. She said, not the investigation, not the documents. She meant the morning before the parking lot. The motorcycle. She said he had known when he walked out that door that his supervisor had already called his name twice, and that the consequence of continuing was likely termination. She said she wanted to know why he had continued. Ezra was quiet for a moment. He said his father used to tell him that a machine will always tell you what it needs, and that the only requirement is to be quiet enough to listen. He said he had been standing in that garage, and he had heard what the situation needed, and the situation needed someone to walk out the door. He said he did not think of it as courage at the time. He said it did not feel like a decision so much as a recognition. The recognition of something that needed doing, and the understanding that he was the one positioned to do it. He said he supposed his father had felt something similar in 1993. The board member looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked at the other board members and then at Chester, and she said she did not think there was much left to deliberate. The deliberation took 11 minutes. Sutter and his lawyer were asked to wait in the reception area during the deliberation, which they did. And when the board reconvened, and Sutter was brought back in the senior board member, the man in his early 70s who had made the remark about evidence and arguments read the board's determination in the level voice of someone who has arrived at a conclusion and has no interest in softening it. The allegations presented by Boyd Sutter Associates were found to be without merit and to have been prepared in bad faith, based on documentation fabricated by a company employee acting as an agent of Sutter Associates. The board was referring the matter to the company's legal counsel for pursuit of civil action against both Garner and Sutter for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and tortious interference with business relations. The board was also directing legal counsel to determine whether criminal referral was appropriate and to advise accordingly. Sutter's lawyer said his client disputed the determination. The senior board member said that was his client's right, and that the appropriate venue for the dispute was the courts, and that the meeting was adjourned. Sutter left without looking at Ezra. His lawyer followed him, and the door closed, and the room was left with the board members, and Chester, and Ezra, and Della, and Rudy, and the documents on the table, and the recognition form with Samuel Cole's name on it, lying flat where Rudy had placed it. The days that followed had the quality of an engine that has been running wrong for a long time and has finally been repaired, the particular smoothness of something operating the way it was designed to operate, which is noticeable precisely because the wrongness had been the environment for so long. Garner was formally terminated that afternoon and was informed by Chester's legal counsel of the civil action being prepared. He retained his own lawyer within 24 hours, which was his right, and the legal machinery of the situation began to move at the pace legal machinery moves, which was not fast, but which was in the right direction. Boyd Sutter's acquisition strategy for Holt and Mercer was effectively ended. The civil action created a legal encumbrance on any transaction involving the company that no reputable financing institution would touch. And Sutter's reputation in the Detroit automotive service market, which had been his primary operating environment for 20 years, sustained damage of the kind that takes years to recover from, if it recovers at all. Ezra reported to the Trumbull Avenue location the morning after the board meeting, not because anyone had told him to specifically, but because it was a workday, and there was work to be done, and he was now the lead technician, and the lead technician was the first one in. He arrived at 5:28, 2 minutes ahead of when he usually arrived. He turned on the lights in bays 1 and 2 and stood for a moment in the early morning quiet of the garage, which was the same quiet it had always been, the quiet of a space before the day begins, the space between broken and fixed, where his best thinking happened. He went to the schedule board. He looked at the vehicles assigned for the morning, and he made adjustments to the assignments. Not dramatic ones, not a wholesale reorganization, but the adjustments that became visible when you looked at the assignments. With attention rather than habit. The adjustments that sent the complex diagnostic work to the people with the diagnostic skill and distributed the load according to ability rather than according to the accumulated default settings of years of someone else's biases. He wrote the new assignments in his own handwriting in the spaces on the board. He put his bag in the office that had been Garner's office and was now his office, and he did not spend time thinking about the transition because the transition was complete, and what mattered was the work that came after it. He took the photograph from his bag. He had brought it from the cabinet above the refrigerator on Maplewood Avenue. The photograph of his father in the uniform with the Holt and Mercer patch, standing in front of the bay door, with his shoulders back and his hands at his sides, and the smile of a man who has found where he belongs. He set it on the desk, not centered, not displayed, just set there. The way you put something in a room because it belongs there, and not because you are decorating. Next to it, he placed the recognition form. Rudy had given it to him after the board meeting, pressing it into his hands in the hallway outside the conference room, with the same brevity he brought to everything that mattered. No ceremony, just the transfer of something from one person to the person it actually belonged to. The two pieces of paper sat on the desk side by side. The photograph from 1993 and the recognition form from 1993. His father's face and his father's name. 31 years between them and this office and this desk and the morning light coming through the window. He looked at them for a moment. Then he went back to the bay. Della arrived at 9:30 as she always did, and she hung her bag on the hook by the break room door and put on her work gloves and looked at the assignment board. She found her name. She found the vehicle she had been assigned. She found that the vehicle was a 2020 BMW 5 Series with an electrical fault that had stumped two other shops. The kind of job that required real diagnostic thinking and would take most of the day and would teach her something she did not currently know. She looked at the assignment for a moment. Then she looked at Ezra across the garage. He was at the workbench with his hands on an engine, not looking up already in the work. She put her gloves on and went to her bay. The morning moved the way mornings in the garage moved in the rhythms of vehicles and tasks and the social weather of a shared workspace, but the weather had changed. It was not a dramatic change. It did not announce itself. It was the change that happens when a room's understanding of itself shifts slightly in the direction of what it was supposed to be, when the people in the room begin to operate on the basis of a different set of assumptions about what is expected and what is possible and what the work is actually for. Pete Sallows worked quietly and competently as he always had. Danny Morse was impatient with the mechanical jobs, as he always was. Calvin Webb told 2 of his 4 jokes before lunch. Ted Grillo did not talk much and worked fast and clean. No one tested the new assignments. At 11:15, a walk-in arrived, a man in his 60s with a pickup truck that had been making a sound he could not identify, the particular anxiety of someone who knows something is wrong and does not know what it means or what it will cost. He came to the bay door, and Ezra came out to meet him, and they stood beside the truck, and Ezra listened to the man describe the sound with the patient attention of someone who understands that a person describing a mechanical problem is not just conveying technical information, but also conveying worry, and that the worry deserves to be heard as carefully as the technical information. He drove the truck to the end of the lot and back, feeling what the engine was doing. He knew what the sound was within 30 seconds of driving. He told the man. He told him in plain language, without minimizing and without catastrophizing what was wrong, and what it would take to fix it, and what it would cost, and how long it would take, the same way he always told people, the way that left them with the information they needed to make their own decision. The man said he appreciated being told straight. Ezra said he would have it ready by 3. He went back to work. The afternoon extended in the way of a good working afternoon. The hours moving with the particular satisfaction of time that is being used. Well, the accumulation of tasks completed, and problems solved, and vehicles returned to the condition of things that work. The sounds of the garage were the sounds of the garage. Pneumatic tools and engines and the fluorescent lights and the movement of people who know what they are doing and are doing it. At 2:45, Della called him over to Bay 4. She had been working on the BMW all day, methodical and patient, following the electrical fault through the system, the way he had taught her, and the way he had been taught, from the known problem toward the unknown cause, not stopping at the first answer. She had found something. She showed him what she had found, not asking him to validate it, but showing him the evidence and the reasoning, presenting it the way she had presented the photographs in the board meeting, directly and completely trusting that what she had done was sufficient and that the showing of it would speak for itself. It was sufficient. He said so. She went back to work. He stood in Bay 4 for a moment after she returned to the vehicle, and he thought about what he was watching, which was someone at the beginning of a long trajectory who did not yet know the length of it. And he thought about what his job was in relation to that, which was not to shorten the trajectory by rushing her toward outcomes she had not yet earned, but to make sure the environment she was moving through allowed her to move through it at the speed and in the direction her ability deserved. He went back to his own bay. At 6 o'clock, after the other techs had left and the bay doors were closed, and the garage was in the particular quiet of the end of a working day, Ezra sat in the office with the door open and wrote the service notes for the vehicles he had completed that day. He wrote them in the same clear, precise language his father had taught him what the problem was and what caused it, and what he did and what to watch for. He wrote them because they were the record. Because the record mattered, because in 10 years someone would open a file and read what he had written and know what had been done to a vehicle and why and by whom. And that person deserved accurate information and a legible account. He finished the notes and capped his pen. He looked at the photograph and the recognition form on the desk. He thought about his father standing in front of the bay door in 1993, the smile and the shoulders and the hands at his sides. And he thought about what his father had known and not known in that moment. He had not known what was coming, the 7 years of work and the fabricated disciplinary document and the lost position and the lost ground and the years of trying to recover it and the disease that ended the recovery before it was complete. He had not known any of that. He had only known what he knew, which was the work and how to do it and what it meant when it was done properly. Ezra thought that was enough. He thought that was in the end the whole thing, to know the work and do it properly, and trust that it meant something, even when you could not see what it would mean, even when the meaning would not arrive, until someone else was sitting in a room 30 years later, looking at your name on a piece of paper. He turned off the office light. He walked through the garage one more time, the way he did at the end of every shift, checking that everything was where it was supposed to be, that nothing had been left running or left open, or left in a state that would create a problem in the morning. The tools on the workbenches, the vehicles in their bays, the schedule board with the next day's assignments already written in his handwriting. He stopped at the bay door and looked back at the garage. The lights were on over the center bays and off over the far ones, and the space had the particular quality of an emptied working environment, a space that has been used for the purpose it was built for, and that will be used for that purpose. Again in the morning, the quiet of a thing that is between moments rather than between purposes. He turned off the center bay lights. He went out through the side door and locked it behind him, and stood in the parking lot in the February dark with his bag over his shoulder and his breath visible in the cold air. He drove home. On Maplewood Avenue, his mother was in the kitchen when he came in, cooking something on the 2-burner with the radio on low, and she looked up when he came through the door and looked at him, the way she always looked at him when he came home from work, checking for the information that his face would give her about what kind of day it had been. She said, "You look different." He said he had some things to tell her. She turned off the burner. He sat at the kitchen table and he told her. He told her all of it from the morning before with Rudy in the parking lot, and the firing to Chester's office, and the archive and the personnel file to the board meeting, and the recognition form, and what Rudy had said. He told her about his father's years at Trumbull Avenue and what had ended them and what the ending had cost. He told her about the form with Samuel Cole's name on it in the typeface of a machine that no longer existed. Dated August 1993. Commended for exceptional work. His mother listened. She sat across the table from him and she listened to the whole thing without interrupting. And when he was done, she was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when something had arrived that needed time to become real. Then she said she had known. He looked at her. She said she had known that the garage was the same one. She had known from the first week when he came home and mentioned the address and the building description. And it matched what she remembered from when she had dropped his father off there, on winter mornings the way she used to sometimes, when the weather was bad and she had the car. She had known and she had not told him, because she had not known how to tell him in a way that gave him the information without also giving him the weight of what had happened there. And she had not known if the weight would help him or slow him down. She said she was sorry she had not told him. He said he understood why she had not. She said he looked like his father when he was working. She said she had always been able to tell when he was in the flow of something that mattered, because his face did a particular thing, a particular quietness, the same quietness Samuel's face had done. And she had seen it in him from the time he was young and had known what it meant. He sat with that for a moment. He said he had one more thing to show her. He reached into his bag and he took out the recognition form and he placed it on the table between them. She looked at it. She looked at the date and the name and the typeface and the signature. And she was very still for a long time. And then she put her hand on the paper flat, the way you put your hand on something to confirm that it is real, and that you are real, and that the distance between you and it is actually as small as it appears to be. She did not say anything. He did not say anything either. They sat at the kitchen table on Maplewood Avenue in Detroit, with the radio on low and the cold February night outside the windows, and the recognition form between them with Samuel Cole's name on it. And the silence between them was the silence of a thing that has found its way back to where it belongs. The silence of a circle that has closed not neatly, not without cost, but completely. He put the form back in his bag. He got up and went to the cabinet above the refrigerator and took down the frame and brought it to the table and set it down where she could see it. His father's face, the smile and the shoulders, the uniform, the bay door. He said he was going to bring this to the office. His mother looked at the photograph and then looked at him. She said yes. He said it belonged there. She said she knew. In the morning he would drive to Trumbull Avenue, and he would arrive at 528, and he would turn on the lights in bays 1 and 2, and stand in the quiet of the garage before the day began. He would put the photograph on the desk in the office where he could see it from the bay. He would make the coffee that was technically coffee, and he would look at the schedule board, and he would go to work. He would go to work the way his father had gone to work, with his hands and his attention, and the understanding that a machine will always tell you what it needs, and that the only requirement is to be quiet enough to listen. He would go to work in the building where his father had worked, in the space his father had given his best years to, under the same lights and on the same floors, and with the same tools organized on pegboards. The way tools should be organized, each one in its place. Each one findable, each absence visible as the absence of something that matters. He would go to work and he would do it properly, and he would trust that it meant something. His father had taught him that. It turned out his father had been right.